Today I'm going to be teaching you how to electrify a bicycle, or in this case, a tricycle, using just 4 components. The 4 components we're going to be using today include, first of all, a lithium battery, next, a 350 watt hub motor, a 350 watt controller, and lastly, a half twist throttle. Today we're going to be using these 4 parts to show you how easy it really is to electrify a bicycle. Let's find out.
Now you're going to want to start by flipping your bicycle over so it's resting on the seat and handlebars. I'm using a tricycle here, so I'll just flip it back 90 degrees so that the wheel is up in the air and easy to work with. Now start by loosening up the axle nuts on the original wheel. This is usually a 15mm hex wrench, but you can use an adjustable wrench here like I'm using. Once you've got those nuts off, go ahead and pull the wheel out. You may need to release the air from the tire and/or open the brakes before you can get it all the way out. Now it's time to start taking the tire off of your original wheel. Now you're going to use a tire lever like this one to get the tire off this wheel. Start by putting the tire lever under the bead and then bending the lever down to pull the bead over the rim. Now put a second tire lever a few inches down and repeat the same process, bending it down to pull the tire bead over the rim. Repeat this process a few times, each time moving the tire lever down a few inches. Once you have enough of the bead off, you can just slide the tire lever around the rim and remove the whole bead. Now you'll have 1/2 of the tire off, but you still need to get that second bead off. You might be able to pull it off with your bare hands, but if it's a little tight, you can use that same tire lever just to get it started on the second side of the tire. Once you have it started, it should be pretty easy to just pull it right off with your hands. When you're pulling it off, make sure you're careful with that valve stem though. You want to pull that out and not stress it too much. Now you'll need to seat that same tire and tube on your new hub motor's rim. Start by sliding one side of the tire onto the rim, getting that first bead up and over the edge of the rim. Next, once you have one bead set, you can place the valve stem into the hole in the rim. It should push right through. Now, start by going around the second side of the tire and placing that bead inside of the rim with your fingers. If it's tight, you might need to use your tire levers just to get that bead up and over the edge. It should get there eventually though, don't force it. Once you've got it all the way up on the edge, you're ready to go and you have your tire nice and seated. Now we're ready to install that wheel, which is pretty simple. Just slide the flats of the axle inside the dropouts. Now if this was a more powerful motor, we'd want to use a torque arm, but this is just a little 350 watt guy, so we don't need a torque arm. We'll actually use this little torque washer, which has a tooth on it. Next, just slide your nuts on the end, and then you're going to tighten those suckers up. Get them finger tight first, and then tighten them with a wrench. After you tighten everything up, you're going to want to check your clearance and make sure you don't have any interference between the hub and the fork. Now it's time to install that battery. So I'm going to go ahead and drop the bike down and start looking at where I want to put this battery. Now your best bet is going to be to try to balance the weight of the bike out. So because I have that motor up in the front, I'm going to consider putting this battery somewhere in the back. Also, I've got this nice cage on the back, which is going to make it easy to mount. On a normal bicycle, you can have a rack over the rear tire, and that's going to help. So here you can see I'm going to mount this battery right on the left side of the rack here. And the nice thing about these types of batteries, these aluminum case batteries, is they generally come with some type of way to connect them to the bicycle. Here I've got these nice tapped steel inserts that I'm going to put behind the cage, and I can bolt right through that metal plate that comes with the battery into those steel inserts. So here I'm going to take the battery off of that metal plate and line that guy up with those metal inserts. And what I'm going to do is use these factory bolts that come with it. This is a nice little battery kit here. I'm going to bolt straight through the cage so I can secure it onto the cage, and I'll have a nice strong mounting point for that battery. One thing I really like about this battery is that the bolt heads are actually sandwiched between the metal plate and the battery, so that someone can't come from behind and try to unbolt it because it's just bolted into that steel plate. Now I'm going to do a test fit here. You can see I'm going to slide the battery straight down onto the metal plate, and you can see it just slides nice and easy. This is what we're looking for, a nice smooth entry for the battery. Now I'll just flip the switch and lock it into place. So that looks good. Now I'll just remove the battery go ahead and put that last steel insert on there, bolt it on tight, and we're going to be good to go. Now it's time to decide how we're going to mount that 350 watt controller. Now we've got a few options. We can go behind the seat post here, we can put it up under the seat, maybe we can mount it onto the cage. There's a lot of different choices. I usually like to go with putting it on the seat post, pointed down in this direction. Now this is so that you have the wires running down and all the water that gets on the controller will actually run down the wires instead of running up the wires into the controller. Now instead of just mounting it straight to the seat post, I'm going to use what came with this kit here, which is a controller box. This is just going to give us a nice little, more aesthetically pleasing way to mount the controller onto the bike and hide some of the ugliness of that controller box. Now these things are really easy to use. You're just going to tuck any extra wires you don't plan on using. Like for this one I've got the speed control wire tucked in because I'm not going to limit the speed. Then once you've got all the wires tucked in and you're sure that you're not going to pinch any of those wires, you can go ahead and start screwing it together. Now you want to do this pretty evenly so you don't apply any extra pressure in one spot and end up breaking the plastic. Sometimes these boxes can be made from kind of cheap plastic. Also, as you're screwing it together, you want to be careful to make sure you're still not pinching any wires. The last thing you want to do is sever one of these wires. The last thing you have to do is just simply bolt it right onto the frame. Like I said, I'm going to mount this one under the seat post, but you can pretty much mount it wherever you want on the bicycle, as long as you have those wires pointing downwards to keep any water that gets on them running down the wires instead of into the controller itself. Now we'll leave those wires hanging there for a minute because now it's time to go ahead and install the throttle. This kit comes with a half-twist throttle with LED lights for measuring battery and this red on-off button. Now to install this, first you're going to have to cut off those old rubber grips you had, or you can slide them off if they're not too stubborn. Now slide on your new half-twist throttle, followed by the plastic spacer. That spacer is going to help keep the throttle from catching on the rubber grip. Lastly, install that half rubber grip that's going to come with your throttle. You can usually just slide it right on the end, though depending on your handlebar size it might take a little muscle to get it all the way on there. Once you have it on, slide your throttle back so that it sandwiches that plastic spacer up against the half rubber grip. Finally, use a 3mm Allen to go ahead and tighten that half twist throttle, and making sure it's at the right angle for you. Some kits come with an additional display, like this one, that has LEDs for measuring battery and an on-off switch. Now you can usually mount these wherever you want on the handlebars. I'm going to go ahead and put it right next to the throttle. Sometimes this is a required part of the kit, and sometimes it's optional. If it has an on and off button, it's usually going to be required so that it can start your controller and get your bike going. Now let's add in that extension wire from the motor to the controller. Make sure you line up the arrows on the connector when you push this guy together. You don't want to misalign it and end up bending those pins. It might take a little muscle to get it together, but don't force it if it doesn't feel right. We'll use the rest of this wire in another moment. Now it's time for the power cable from the battery to the controller. This kit came with a connector, but it didn't come connected, so we're going to have to rig this ourselves. You can see in the connector we've got a couple pins here that are going to be our plus and minus pins, but we're not actually going to use that middle ground pin. Now let's start by stripping the wires so that we can get them ready to connect to those pins in the connector. Now take the pins out of the plastic connector and start backing those screws out. You're going to retighten them once you have the wire wrapped around them. You don't want to make sure you do this pretty securely. If you don't feel like it's secure, you can add a bit of solder. Once you have them secured, replace them inside of the connector. Next you'll just replace this little red tab over the wires, and this will help hold them securely, so if you have any stress on the cable, it won't immediately pull on those screwed connections you made. You just screw that tab in through the back side, and then you can replace the top of the connector. Here there's going to be a bolt that goes all the way through the connector. Now we're going to strip the other side of our power cable so we can connect it to the controller. Start by stripping each of those individual wires. Now, before we can actually connect the connector, we need to know which wire is plus and which is minus. So here we're going to test it with a voltmeter while it's plugged into the battery. I'm going to put the red probe on the blue wire, and we see a plus 30 volts. This is a 24 volt battery, so that's like a full battery charge. Now if I reverse the wire just to check, and I put the red probe on the brown wire, I see a minus. That shows me the blue is definitely the plus. So this is how we'll check. Next, we're just going to tighten those pins onto the wires. You can use a set of needle nose pliers just to crimp those down nice and firmly. If you feel like it's not firm though, you can add a bit of solder. Now we're going to add the second pin. This one's on the blue wire, so this is going to be our positive pin. And when we do the positive, we're actually going to place the positive wire from the throttle in as well. This is going to give us the positive reading for our battery measurement. Now we're going to go ahead and crimp that positive pin on as well. And now we can place both those pins inside the connector housing. If you need to, you can also use a screwdriver just to push them in the rest of the way until you hear a click. Now we're going to go ahead and start securing all of our wires. Cable ties are going to be your best friend here. You can secure everything you need with these cable ties. Just be careful when you cut them to make sure you do it nice and flush, because you don't want to be left with a sharp end here that can end up cutting you. When you're working with the motor wires, you want to make sure you create a drip loop so that the wire immediately exits down from the axle before coming back up to the fork. This helps by allowing any water that gets onto the wire to actually drip down onto the ground and not follow the wire back into the motor. Go ahead and secure these wires all the way up the fork, making sure you're leaving enough freedom so that when you turn the fork, you're not going to end up ripping the wire out. Again, make sure when you cut these that you're doing it nice and flush. Now we're going to set our connectors. Let's start with our hall connectors, which is going to be this 6-pin connector. Then we're going to move to our motor phase connectors. These are 3 individual connectors. Next is going to be our throttle, which is a small 3-pin connector, and our power connector that we already created. Make sure you leave that power connector out of the battery though when you plug it together. Lastly, we're going to plug in our display that we put on the handlebars next to the throttle. And those are all the connections you need to make. You can see how simple making those connections is. Now you see all this mess of wires we have hanging off the handlebars? I like to clean this up using spiral plastic wrap. This stuff is great because it will hold on to all these wires and keep them organized together and just basically looking nicer. So the way this works is you start by rolling it onto an individual wire and sliding it up to the beginning of that wire. Then you can start wrapping it around all of those wires together. Now this is kind of a tedious process. It takes a while, but it's going to be worth it because you can see how much nicer this is going to make all of your wires look, especially when you just bring all these wires together in the front of your bike. It just leaves a much more professional looking finish. Once you get down to the wires by the controller, you want to start bringing the extra wire slack together. Here I'm just going to hold it together with a couple of cable ties before I continue using that wire wrap. This way everything is connected away from the pedals and isn't going to get caught on my feet or the pedal cranks when I'm pedaling. You can also use black electrical tape for this to make sure you connect all these wires together and seal it all nicely. Now with this leftover spiral wrap, I'm just going to continue wrapping it around the power cord just to use it up. And now you can see we're left with a nice professional looking finish. To connect this wire cord, we're just going to go around with a few more cable ties on the frame here. This will keep it from dragging on the ground or getting it caught on the pedal arms. Connecting this power cord was the final step for installing everything on this bike.
Once you've secured all your wires, you're pretty much ready to go. Just check your tire pressure, make sure all your connections are secure, and then hey, have some fun. You earned it.